the tragedy of otherwise good relationships is that we stop being curious. Why is it that we can share a life with someone and yet slowly lose access to their inner world? When I say I know my partner, does that mean I have given myself permission to stop looking, to stop discovering who they are and who they're committed to becoming in the world? Because in that case, our knowingness can become closure, and it can actually create a barrier between us because we say there's nothing left to discover here. And that's just not true. I think people are infinitely interesting, and there is always more to discover. Welcome to the Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So, grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Intimate Philosopher. I am your host, Dr. Emma Smith, and I am so glad that you're joining me again for this episode. We're going to do something that's a little bit of a throwback because today is a solo episode. It's just you and me. You know, this is a byproduct of receiving feedback from y'all. When I first started out, if you recall, the first several episodes, I think it was 12, I did by myself. And that was a deliberate choice on my part because I was trying to get used to the equipment and everything else. And I thought, okay, before I bring anybody else into this, let me get my act together. And so I did a bunch of solo episodes. And one of the things that happened is people kept saying that they liked my voice and that it was soothing to them. And when I started doing interviews, people said, you know, your interviews are great, but I liked your voice so much better when you're by yourself. And I thought that was really interesting feedback. So here I am. If you ask, I will try to deliver and also try to figure out how to create some consistency, I guess. I don't know. I think it's the difference between when you're talking to like one person, you know, when I'm doing this, I have just you in mind. And I think that when I'm in a conversation, a two-way conversation, a lot of times it's matching the energy of that person. And I'm so happy that they've agreed to come on because I think that they're so brilliant. So anyway, that's what we're doing today. And I hope that you enjoy it. So before I dive into today's episode, I want to just kind of put some things on the table and say, hey, we're operating within this context. And the first one is the life gets busy context, right? I think it's fair to say that most of us are pretty busy these days. And the second context is the question of, you know, do you believe or would you say that relationships, any relationship, not just your sexual or romantic ones, but any relationship, takes some level of effort to maintain? And the third question or context is, you know, how many of you have experienced having the same conversation with your partner more than once and realizing that it didn't actually resolve anything? You were just wearing different clothes when you were talking, but it didn't actually do anything, didn't do what it was supposed to do. And then my last contextual piece is, you know, how many of you would say that your relationship is good on paper, but there's still parts of it that feel stuck and flat or harder than you expected? Like, even though things are good, there's still these rough edges that can throw you or your partner off your game. And If that is you, if you can agree with these contexts and questions that I just threw out there, I think this episode is for you because what we're going to talk about today is the relationship between bids for connection that you heard Dr. Olivia and I talk about a few weeks ago now, curiosity, and the deliberate choice to remain open to discovery and discovering of your partner. So, when I think about long term love, one of the tragedies, if you will, of long term love is it's not that we fight, it's not that we argue. A lot of people think that that is like the worst thing that can ever happen in a relationship, and it's not. I would posit that the tragedy of many otherwise good relationships is that we stop being curious. Why is it that we can share a life with someone and yet slowly lose access to their inner world? Right? Like we want the closeness and we want to know the person. Think back to the beginning of relationships. I know that I reference the beginning of relationships a lot, and sometimes people are like, well, that's just the honeymoon phase. Yes, and there were some really great things that we do in the quote unquote honeymoon phase that we stop doing when we lose that, when we're no longer literally on drugs. And I think it's important to say, just because you can't go back to that particular segment of your relationship doesn't mean we can't learn something from the behaviors that helped that relationship get established. So we want this closeness and we want the mystery. We like unwrapping presents. We like to discover new things about people. We want the safety, but we also want this feeling of vitality and knowing that we are so much more than maybe what normal everyday life allows us access to or allows us to reflect. And the last one is, we love predictability. We love the safety, the steadiness of it, but we also like being surprised. And I'm not talking about necessarily like a surprise party. I'm talking about the surprise that comes with discovery. It's the surprise of walking out to your car and seeing this beautiful sunset when you're leaving the office. It's that feeling of awe, right? And what I see over and over again with couples and even in my own life is not that couples who love each other stop caring. It's that I think we begin to relate to a version of each other that we assume still exists. And yet, over years and years and years together, there's no way. I mean, if you are committed to fully evolving as a person, there's no way that that same version of our partner or ourselves exists in an unchanged way. And I think that's really important to remember. How many of you feel like most of your conversations are logistical? Like if you had to rate the proportionality of logistical conversations to curiosity conversations about your partner, what would that ratio be? And the goal here isn't to say that you're supposed to have more curiosity conversations than logistical conversations. See previous comment about how life is busy, right? So I'm not suggesting that we need to completely invert it, but we also do need to be mindful that the one side is going to almost automatically dominate. And so we have to be mindful about making sure that we're still making room for those conversations about curiosity. And one of the ways that we can do this, and like, I don't identify myself as a Gottman therapist in a kind of principle kind of way. I am Gottman trained. So I do a lot with their principles, but I wouldn't say that I necessarily practice from this lens in my office. However, for a podcast or for workshops, I think it is so um, accessible to folks. And so you'll hear me using a lot of that language and referencing it because I think it is such a great teaching tool and learning tool. Love maps is one of the things that the Gottmans talk about. And it's really interesting because love maps aren't just about knowing your partner, it's about resisting this urge to buy into the illusion that you already do know them in totality and that there isn't anything left to discover. When you say you know your partner, one of the things that we have to take a look at is when I say I know my partner, does that mean I have given myself permission to stop looking, to stop discovering who they are and who they're committed to becoming in the world? Because in that case, our knowingness can become closure and it can actually create a barrier between us because we say, there's nothing left to discover here. And that's just not true. I think people are infinitely interesting and there is always more to discover because we are always becoming. An intimacy, like that deep, powerful intimacy that so many people are craving, it requires ongoing attention. A lot of times we talk about intimacy as the closeness and the safety. And then I talk about desire as this wanting and this mystery, but they actually are linked and they kind of flow back and forth with one feeding the other. That process of discovery allows the other person to become known to us, which creates intimacy, which can create the safety and the permission giving to continue to discover. And it can be this reciprocal cycle, but that doesn't happen on accident. And the other thing about love maps, and if you haven't figured this out by now, love maps are about questions and opening up dialogue and conversation. It's not an actual map. But love maps, they need negative space because they need the room for discovery. And, it's not just about data mining. It's about learning not just the facts about that person, but what it means to them and to go in an iterative way back and forth with each other. Always so interesting to me when a partner will realize that they were operating on an outdated understanding of the other person. Some of us are old enough to remember when GPS first became a thing. And I remember my mom bought me a TomTom. This was in the days before Wi-Fi. Some of you may remember this. And you literally had to physically plug the thing into your computer to update your maps. Because otherwise, especially if you lived in an area like I did in New Jersey, where construction was happening all the time, there would be roads that it would tell you to go down that no longer existed. Or there would be roads that the GPS would tell you not to go down because according to it and its last map update, that road didn't exist, right? And it led to some interesting rerouting at times because I would neglect to update my maps. And I think this is a really great analogy. We do this with each other too. We forget to be curious and update our maps. So, what's the takeaway? Well, here's one of the takeaways is this week, instead of assuming that you know something about your partner, ask them about it, right? So, if I'm at I don't know, this is going to be such a stupid example, but if I'm at the grocery store and I'm going to pick up, a pint of ice cream, and I think that I know that my partner likes a certain kind, a certain brand, a certain flavor, I could just make the assumption and go along with that. And maybe my partner would love that because they're like, oh, you know me so well. Or I can take this opportunity to be curious and say, hey, do you still like this flavor? Or is there something else that feels appealing to you right now? That is not a negation of me knowing and expressing that knowing. It is a curiosity. Get the difference? If you don't, let me know. And by sending me a comment and I'll try to figure out another way to say it. But I think you get it. I want to pause here for a second and tell you about a tool that I genuinely use every single week, and I paid for it myself. I've used it for about the last 6 months, and this is the planner from Nine to Kind. As you know, our brains are designed to prioritize threat detection over everything else, right? So maybe you didn't know that, but it's true. And the truth is also that right now our brains are having to process a lot of information, so much so that it's actually overwhelming our working memory. So if you find yourself feeling less, oh, I don't know, like on point or forgetting random things, it's not really you. Okay. And at the same time, you still have to figure out how to function within it. So I think it's great when I see other people doing like the aesthetic bullet journaling, but I'm not doing that. So I had to find something else. And one of the things I love about this planner is that it actually combines real structure with emotional regulation because it was designed by an actual therapist. And, there's DBT informed prompts, there's space to track how you're actually doing. And this feature actually mattered more than I expected. There are built in notebook pages right inside each week. So my thoughts and my meetings stay where they belong. And my ADHD brain really appreciates that one. So no more juggling multiple notebooks. That in and of itself is worth checking out. You can use code EMMA20 for 20% off. And if you're like me, a GSD woman who wants to take care of herself without turning self care into yet another project, this one actually works for me. And I think you'll love it. And it helps support the show. So go to 9tokind.com and remember, use code EMMA20 for 20% off your order. Okay, back to the show. I want to transition away from the love maps specifically and talk about that curiosity that's kind of underpinning what we're talking about today. We often talk about curiosity as a communication skill, and it's so much more than that. I think that curiosity can actually be framed as an act of desire. To be curious is to not allow yourself to resist the urge, if you will, to collapse the other person into just something familiar and not something to be explored. And when we're curious, not only do we not collapse, but we actually help preserve the otherness of our partner, which creates this sense of vitality and a need to stay engaged and keep discovering. I mean, think about it. Curiosity isn't just what helps us connect, it's one of the things that can keep us from going numb to the other person. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important. So, what does this actually look like? Well, it can be in the form of questions. For example, what's been taking up more space in your mind lately? Or what feels different about you these days, like to you? Or lastly, what are you longing for, or what would you wish would happen that you haven't had the chance to say out loud? And the truth is that if they haven't listened to this podcast, those may sound like very odd questions. And that's okay, because you know what that's going to do? That can ignite curiosity in them about you. And then you get to say, well, I was listening to this podcast and this lady told me that I should ask you these questions because curiosity is an act of desire. And then you can laugh about it because some of these questions are kind of funny to, be hit with in the middle of the work week. And I think that's great. Like if you think about it, how many of you have learned something surprising about someone close to you? And maybe you learned it a lot later than you expected. I can't think of what the specific thing was, but I just learned something about someone I have known for decades. And that was really intriguing. And also, I was like, how has this never come up before now? Well, it just didn't. And I'm so glad that it did because now there's something more to discover. And if we keep this kind of moving along, if curiosity is how we discover each other, then those bids for connection that we were talking about on a couple episodes ago when I was talking about this, those bids are the bridges that we build to reach for that knowingness, to connect and to say, hey, you are still somebody I'm interested in discovering and knowing. And every small moment, every time you reach, every comment, every glance, it's also this inherent question of, do you still see me too? Do you see me taking interest? Do you see me trying to engage? And not in the way that is like manipulative and producing a specific result. I mean this genuinely, wanting to be known and wanting to have your care and your desire to connect known and validated and hopefully reciprocated. I think it's also important to acknowledge the flip side, that bids for connection can actually also be negative. And so think about it. A complaint or a criticism is also, in many ways, a bid for connection. And it says, see me. It doesn't say it very effectively. It's not going to typically elicit the response that we want. And nevertheless, it's there. A joke is also a bid for connection. Did you ever meet somebody and they were just verbally flailing and maybe telling jokes or laughing at inappropriate times or something like that? And you're like, what is going on with this person? Maybe one of the things is that they are trying to be seen. And however ineffective it is for that moment, that's what they've got in their toolbox and that's what they're using. Another one is touch. You know, does your partner reach out to hold your hand? That's a bid for connection too. So just kind of being mindful that it's not always going to come out in the form of a question. Sometimes it's going to be a more silent bid. I think if I wanted to wrap this kind of portion up, one of the things that is so important to realize is that every bid carries a question underneath it, which is, do I still matter to you? Or do you still want to know me and connect with me? And so when we start seeing that in that way, I think that's really important, actually. And, when I was listening to the episode from a couple times ago when we were talking about bids for intimacy, I had alluded to a conversation I had had with a coworker, and I realized that the episode got too long. And so I never actually ended up telling the story. So I will briefly share it with you here because I think it's relevant. And I also love trying not to silo romantic and sexual relationships as these, enigmatic things that exist completely outside the realm of regular human relating. It has some different qualities to it for sure. And it is not fair to position them as just, entirely unique and on their own planet. You can actually use a lot of these relational tools in other settings. So, once upon a time, I worked in a place where I had a desk and it faced away from the door. And so people would pop their head in my office all the time to tell me something. And I either had to physically turn my entire body around or not. And, I could still hear them, but I would be like typing away. And it was one of those jobs, I'm sure you've had this too, where the position probably should have been split into multiple people. And due to whatever budget constraints, it wasn't. And so I always had more work than I could possibly get done. And this one coworker, I swear they had radar to say that, oh, is Emma up against a hard deadline? Now would be a great time to go talk to her. And so when that would happen, I would get really annoyed and I would, partially turn around. Like I wasn't blatantly rude, but I definitely typically did not fully stop what I was doing. And I mean, they did this multiple times a day, right? So I read the book, The Relationship Cure, as I had mentioned. And the next time it happened, I stopped and I fully turned around and I listened to their question and gave them an answer. And then, I kind of ended the conversation and went back to my task. And it was so fascinating because one, when I fully stopped and turned around and engaged, one of the things that happened is I was less annoyed, which I have theories on that, but that's kind of irrelevant. And the other thing was that they stopped interrupting me. It was so fascinating. They started asking me, "Hey, is now a good time?" Or "At some point today, can I talk to you about?" And I thought this was so fascinating that on some level, they were able to pick up on the difference and respond accordingly. And I just think that is so cool. So I guess for you, with this in mind, I guess the question I want to leave you with is, how many of you can think of a moment where you realized later that someone was trying to connect with you and you totally missed it? And can you commit to trying to recognize those bids earlier on and really give yourself the experience of fully turning toward that person and seeing what happens? I think a lot of times we end up not responding fully, not because we don't care, but because life really crowds out our attention. And I think also, familiarity convinces us that there's nothing new to see. To go back to this work example, this is somebody I had worked with for a while. And apparently, there was some part of me that thought I knew what this person was going to ask me and that it wasn't that important and it didn't deserve my full attention. And that ended up absolutely not being the case. So, I just want to remind you of that. And you can practice, you don't always have to practice with your spouse on these things or your partner. You can practice in other areas of your life and bring that home, right? What a great way to say, "Hey, I tried this thing today and here's what happened." That's an interesting conversation and it's not a logistical one. So that's one of the ways that we can engage in that. Okay. All right. I know. We're going to bring it back to sex though, right? Because this is the Intimate Philosopher podcast and we have to talk about sex. So let's talk about curiosity during sex. It truly is one of the places where we actually need the most curiosity, and it's often the place where we feel the least safe to ask. It's one of the places where we need the most curiosity, and it's also often the place where we feel the least safe to ask the questions that we want to ask. And, in long term relationships, I think we stop asking. Well, I don't know if we stop asking or if most of us just never started asking, "What do you like?" Or "What would feel good to you?" Or "Hey, can we try something new?" I there's just so much, but most of us never learned how to have those conversations. And a lot of us still don't feel comfortable naming what we want. And sometimes a lot of times when I talk about this, I hear, "I'm afraid that my partner will judge me." But the truth is that a lot of times I think it's closer to people judging themselves. And it's just easier to say that you are concerned about your partner's judgment than your own self judgment. So, just something to be aware of. Sexuality, it's so vulnerable. It really is. There's that nakedness, there is no armoring up, there's full presence. And that makes it all the more tempting to be able to default to assumptions and to, like, I think, well, if we're being real honest, I think a lot of desire issues, a lot of that desire discrepancy that people come in with, and that's the number one issue that people go and see sex therapists for. I think that a lot of times the desire issues are actually misattuned bids for connection, that people are missing one another. Why? Well, because nobody taught us to have this conversation. And the assumption ends up being, if I touch you, I'm asking a question of, are you open to this? And if I withdraw from you, is the assumption you don't want this, you don't want me, it's not safe? Like, what is going on? What is the assumption that you think you're making in that moment. And it's going to be different for everyone, and every relationship's going to be different. The thing that's important is to remember to ask and not assume what's going on. I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're either wrong and you learn, or you're right. You may assume correctly. And wouldn't it be lovely for your partner to experience being known? I think that sometimes we rob ourselves of really positive experiences in relationships because of that self protection. So, what are some questions that I can leave you with that maybe offer an invitation to connect erotically? One of my favorite questions is, what helps you feel the most wanted these days? Close second to that is, when do you feel the most connected to your own sense of desire and want? And a third one could be, when do you feel the closest to me? Or, if you feel like you keep missing one another, what's been getting in the way of us connecting, or, you reaching out for me? Now, I will say this. These questions, they're these aren't questions that you just like fire off at your partner with no context whatsoever and no bigger conversation to follow. These questions in particular are doors that you open and that you invite your partner to walk through, and then you stay there with them. So these aren't questions to ask as you're running out the door. These are questions to sit down and connect and become known to one another. As I get ready to close this out, I was trying to think about a kind of gentle structure for you so that you could like think about, these episodes. They're dense, right? Like they have a lot of stuff in them. And so I tried to break this down, and it's the 3 N's: notice, name, and nurture. So you want to notice that something just happened, something new, something unexpected, whether it's negative, positive. We like to accentuate the positive. Then you want to name. So if you're curious, like, is your partner suddenly doing acts of service because they want sex, or because they love you and they know that you have a lot on your plate? And so you can notice that it's happening, and then you can name it by asking a question. Are you wanting to connect right now? Or something to that effect. And then nurture. So when you ask a question, you have to be willing to stay to hear the answer. And so nurture that connection, nurture that stepping into that doorway that just got open. So you respond and you stay and you engage. And, for this week, what if you stayed in the moment 30 seconds longer than you normally would? What would that be like? Intimacy, long-term intimacy isn't built on how much you know about each other. I think it's built on the commitment and your willingness to keep discovering, and not treating knowing your partner like it's going to benefit you in, Tuesday night trivia. It's not about that. It's about wanting to take into consideration new information about them and assimilate it into loving them well. So I'll leave you with 3 more questions, and these are for you to think about. These aren't necessarily to ask your partner about, although they might be interesting. Question number 1 is, when did you last experience your partner as mysterious? And if it's been a minute, you can do it now, right? There's nothing stopping you. Your partner is actually a mystery. What if we allowed that to be true? Question 2, are you actually relating to your partner, or are you relating to your idea of who they are? And 3, what is one question that you are willing to ask tonight without knowing, assuming, or guessing what the answer will be? I can't wait to hear how these go. And if you try them, I would love to hear about it. You can let me know in the comment section. You can let me know by submitting a feedback form that's linked in the show notes. You can message me on Instagram at the Intimate Philosopher Podcast. And if you just cannot get enough of this kind of thing, if you are just so hungry for ways to connect deeper and more meaningfully with your partner, yes, you love each other, you're amazing at co-facilitating life together, and you want more, I'm going to have something so incredible and so special coming up in a little bit of time, probably sometime over the summer. I'll be ready to announce it, but I'm going to put a link to get on my wait list so you can be the first person to know about it. It's going to be similar to those Friday sessions that I was doing, but it is going to be a little bit longer and a lot longer and definitely deeper because we'll have time to go into it. I'm really, really excited. It's going to be a masterclass style. And if you're a fan of this podcast, you are definitely going to want to know about this other thing that I have coming up. So there's my little teaser for you. And yeah, until next time, keep on figuring out that messy business of being human. Thank you so much for listening. It's a pleasure to do this with you. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.